Good morning. This is Mike Layton. I'm the owner of Stochastic Marketing, and for first-time listeners, Stochastic has worked with hundreds of HVAC and plumbing contractors, and as we've fine-tuned our data analytics and the mirror score, but people and their experiences are behind all the numbers. So today, we'd like to talk with Eric Wytrwal about his experiences as a marketing director in an HVAC and plumbing contractor. Good morning, Eric.
How you doing today, Mike?
Not bad. Hey, just for our audience, before you joined Stochastic about 5.5 years ago, you were the head of marketing at about a $7 million HVAC and plumbing contractor in Florida. Isn't that right?
Yeah, that's correct. When I joined, we were somewhere between $3.5 and $4 million in sales, and when I made the transition over to Stochastic, we were doing between 7 and 7.5 million in sales there.
All right. Well, before that, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, during that time, we also launched our plumbing company, which when I left was about $1 million in sales. So, yeah,
okay.
We had grown quite a bit.
So before that, you were in the tobacco and timeshare industry, weren't you?
Yeah, I was the regional director for smokeless tobacco sales for the state of Wyoming and handled all of the sales there for U.S. smokeless tobacco across that state, a part of Colorado, and a little bit of a few of the other outlying areas where the interstate kind of passed over the state line. And when our company was purchased and we were given the opportunity to find a new job, I moved into the timeshare industry for about a year and a half before moving into the HVAC industry.
Well, there's a big difference between Wyoming and the panhandle of Florida, I suspect. More than just climate, right?
A whole lot of difference, but you know, I'm married, and when the wife says she prefers the beach to the mountains, you go to the beach, right?
Well, what was the biggest difference between HVAC and plumbing marketing than your other industries?
Well, the big difference, especially between that and the tobacco industry, was where you kind of start things. When I was selling tobacco, my job was not so much to sell more cans of smokeless tobacco at a store in part. My job was to make the store more successful overall, which brought in more people, which sold more tobacco. And all of the numbers and criteria, all the background analytics that drove all of the things we did in a store were really to drive that forward. So if I knew a certain kind of soda would help propel sales, and if they advertised for that kind of soda, it would bring in more customers, it was my job really to bring that to the customer, and my customer being in that case the store owner themselves, and kind of reposition their whole store so that more of my product would sell. So it was really a top-down process. Whereas when I moved into the HVAC industry, I was given a whole lot of numbers and analytics, or what I thought were analytics, industry standards, I should say, and there was really no criteria for where those numbers came from. Oftentimes when you would dig into those numbers, I could never find a solid answer as to why that was the assumption, and whereas with tobacco, I could back up that if I sell more Dr. Pepper in a store, that will lead to more sales of this kind of tobacco. I didn't see that same correlation in this industry where someone would give me a number that I was supposed to set things up by, and then I would see those numbers reflected in my business. It actually operated a lot more like timeshare, where this was a big one-time purchase and I didn't see the customer again. There wasn't a lot of longevity there. But I didn't realize that for the first few months that I was in the industry, probably out to about the first year, where it started to occur to me that my industry standards, the things I was chasing after with my marketing, were not reflected in the sales we were actually making. And it was really starting to align more with kind of a timeshare deal where I was in it to sell to the customer now because I had to get the money today.
Well, think back. I know it's been a while, but think back to that first week on the job in the HVAC industry. I assume that the U.S. smokeless tobacco pretty much had a big, thick binder that told you just what to do, right? Whether it's selling Dr. Pepper and linking that to Skoal or whatever that might be. But think back to that first week on the job years ago in the HVAC industry. What did the owner tell you about contractor marketing?
Well, the conversation we had was really about where we were generating leads from, how many leads we needed, and how could we get more leads. And at the time, this was almost a decade ago now, the conversation was really about how do we force ourselves online. Should we be doing social marketing? You've got to realize Facebook was not quite the behemoth it was today, but it was on the rise at that point. MySpace was still hanging around at that time frame. So the big push was, how can you get me online so I can capitalize on these online leads? And then the same question I get still today in this job is, of course, how do we get more leads? That was the thing that was kind of handed to me, and I was handed a book. I was working for a company that was part of a franchise that basically labeled what I should expect from my technicians in the field. So if they went on 10 calls, I should expect one flip. So then I needed to get 10 calls to get one flip that way, and then best practices when it came to direct mail, web, etc. And it laid out a criteria of you should spend this much, 7% in that case, on marketing as a maximum, 4% as a minimum. And that's kind of what set the expectations of everything that I was handed.
So, as his marketing director, and of course you're a marketing director in a relatively small business, which is different than U.S. tobacco, big scale question difference. But as his marketing director, what did he say? What did the owner say about what he wanted from you, kind of right out of the gate? You started a new job and hadn't been in the industry. How did he set the goals for you as a marketing director?
Sure. So our initial conversation was kind of a split. First was take care of solely the online implementation. So he wanted me to, out of the gate, kind of take everything online that existed, which was a website that had a phone number that rang to the wrong location. Fix that, get us onto social media, get us onto Twitter, Facebook, etc. That was kind of my sole responsibility from day one, and then slowly integrate over time, taking over things like direct mail, newspaper, community outreach, and things of that nature. And all of those things was really a lead-based number is what my job was required. We had kind of a monthly budget. This is the amount of dollars we need to bring each month, and this is your marketing spend based on that budget. You have to stay within that budget and then bring in X number of leads, which should lead to X number of sales. And so my criteria was set based on bringing in those leads, and then a lead cost. The big thing, and the internet really didn't have it, which is why the two were separate. The cost per lead seemed to be one of the driving factors of everything we were doing. I needed to keep my cost per lead under $100, specifically on a tune-up, and under $150, if possible, on a replacement lead. And those were the main criteria that were set from day one.
Okay, so you seem to have some specific goals for cost per lead for service, social media, and replacement social media. Did he tell you what a new customer was worth or should be worth? Was that part of the conversation?
That was never part of the discussion. It was always left to the idea if we got in the home, the salesman would make it happen. So at the end of the month, the dollars were the important number, not on the individual return on investment or individual value of each customer. That's actually not a number I probably discussed until my second year with the company, where we started to actually do some evaluation of what a customer was worth to us. But in the initial discussion, it was all about cost per lead and not about what the value of a customer was after we acquired them.
So when you first started, which I think is pretty common for a lot of the marketing directors that we come across, when they come into the industry, they've come from outside the industry. So when you first started, was the owner making all the decisions, or did he give you free rein to make changes to his marketing techniques, or kind of how did that go?
Well, I think it was kind of a unique time in the sense that most people didn't have an online presence. So as I kind of said before, I was given really free rein. I was given a budget, but a free rein as to what I wanted to do with that budget when it came to online presence. The rest of it was kind of a trickle effect where over time he would introduce me to the folks who we were buying media or we were buying advertising from, and I would sit down and have a conversation and we would lay out the plan. And it was really over the course of probably 3 or 4 months that those things were slowly moved to my plate. And just because of the season that I came on, a lot of our negotiations for phone books and newspaper ads, television ads, etc., were about 4 months beyond when I was hired. So we were into those negotiations, and right about then, after that conversation where he kind of sat in with me, that was the end of the process. I was the lead on those negotiations, although he was there with me. And from that point on, we kind of moved to where he was my backup, and he was checking more what I was doing and less involved in the day-to-day process of it. So probably about a 4-month window before he gave me the reins.
So, which is pretty quick. So how long do you think it took you to feel like you had a handle on what it took to generate new customers?
It probably took me the better part of a year to really grasp and understand the different aspects of the business and the differences in the customers, because a tune-up customer is not going to have the same value overall as a straight replacement customer, which everybody knows from the beginning. But the cost associated with acquiring them is drastically different, and the long-term life cycle of those customers are all things that take some time to understand. Also, the ins and outs of the industry. You come into this industry with a lot of preconceived notions about marketing that you get from selling tobacco or selling timeshare, et cetera, that these are, marketing staples. But this industry is kind of its own unique beast in the sense that not everything that works in the general scope of marketing works in this area. It's an odd product. There's nothing flashy, exciting. It's not like buying a new car. It's a purchase you actually make less often than a new car. And I can't remember the last time I was at a barbecue and anybody took me out to show me their new AC. But I can tell you before I worked in the industry, it had never happened. And so it took quite a bit of time, about a year, for me to really grasp what it was going to take to acquire a new customer, where most of my new customers came from, and also the difference in value based on where I acquired that customer from. So a customer that came from a website's value versus one that came from a Valpak ad versus one that came from a home show. And assessing those different values allowed me really to, in my second year, better implement all my marketing. And during that time, that was one of our biggest growth periods over that second and into my third year there, when we really kind of just exploded. And while I can't take all the credit for that, our marketing worked a lot more successfully those years. And that second year was actually the downturn after the tax credit had ended. So we still had a lot of growth that year, even though we had lost the tax credit. I know a lot of companies, that was a real tough year for them.
Well, in a typical contractor, the owner, it's not like U.S. Tobacco or Fortune 500 types where it's a big operation and you can kind of hide. In every contractor, for the most part, we deal with, the owner is literally right down the hall, right on top of everything.
Absolutely.
How long do you think before the owner agreed that you knew what you were doing? Because you were in daily contact with them, right? I mean,
yeah,
throughout the day,
absolutely.
Right?
Yeah, I would say that, and I see this also, for my case, I would say probably never totally. But I think that's with any small business. The owner always wants to have a part of it because they're so invested in it. And when you hire a marketing manager, even if they're as invested, and I was very invested in the company, and I don't think anybody would question that. I love the company I work for, and I love the people I work for, especially the owners. And there's still, though, when you own a company, that desire to kind of have your finger in the pie, right? And so there was always a questioning of what we were doing, why we were doing it, was it successful? And challenging the owner, I think, actually helped build some of that credibility, because there were times when I would see a product and we would decide to implement it, and the owner would not see the benefit. And so by going in and actually digging down and saying, look, this is what we spent, this is what the return, this was the value of the customer we picked up from these things, I found that built my credibility. And probably as loose as the reins ever got, which was relatively loose, those things started to come when I started to actually go in, do the research, and show the owner, this is what we get when we do this, and this is the value of the customer we take away from them versus when we do something else or when we don't spend that money. And I think by doing those things, which I really didn't start doing until my second year, and actually digging into those things, I started to get those reins loosened, as loose as they'd get in any business, I think, where the owner is just down the hall.
Well, so many of a lot of your, I guess, story, your path is similar to what we see from so many other marketing directors that come into the HVAC or plumbing business. They came to it from digital. They might have worked a while at an agency. Maybe they were working for a supplier. They were working for the company that sold Yellow Pages ads or radio or whatever. But they've come from another industry, I guess. What advice would you give to someone who is coming into a marketing job from outside the HVAC or plumbing industry? What would you tell them to look out for or question when they start to take on responsibility for really a lot of very different marketing techniques that you wouldn't normally expect them to have a lot of background in, say, direct mail, or maybe they came from the Yellow Pages and they're not real familiar with radio. What advice would you give somebody like that, either as a peer or someone that's just a newbie when they're coming into the industry and trying to take some responsibility, some credit for success or failure in marketing in the HVAC or plumbing industry?
Well, I come from kind of a unique position where before joining Stochastic, I was kind of in the role to do that, as my owner was also a national brand president for a franchise. And I had that conversation with actually a lot of new folks, and one of the first things I always told them was, A, challenge all of the numbers you're given by looking at your own numbers. So if 1 in 10 leads is supposed to turn into a replacement, then do your own numbers hash that number out? Do you see that in your own data? Because if you don't know your own data first, which I didn't probably for my first 4 months because I didn't know what I was looking at. So I took everything I was given as the Bible, and it wasn't. What I found when I looked into our numbers that we varied drastically from what I was handed as the overall template. The second thing I would tell them is take every bit of marketing advice you get from other companies with a question and a grain of salt. And the question should be, why aren't you still doing it today? And because I would always hear stories about the greatest thing somebody did, or that wonderful mail piece, or the thing we did 10 years ago. Many of those stories came from within our own company. And I always regret not knowing to ask the question, why are you not still doing it today, when somebody would tell me about something they did great 5 or 10 years ago? Because that question answers so much. If they don't have a reason why they're not doing it, then the answer's simple, because it didn't really work that well. Why else would they have stopped? And I think that question was probably the one, had somebody told me my first year, would have saved me a lot of difficult decisions and poor decisions on my part in implementing things. So that's probably where I would start. Also, the other thing I would say is do sit down and talk with companies, bigger and smaller than you, because remember, just because a company's smaller than you doesn't mean that they're operationally, their marketing, et cetera, are not actually more productive, and they don't get a better return on their marketing dollars, a better overall company. They don't have a better overall company just because their dollar figures are smaller than yours. There are a lot of guys out there who run small companies very, very efficiently, much more efficiently than larger ones. And having had the opportunity while I was still with that company to talk to lots of those companies, kind of opened my eyes to a lot of those things and allowed me to implement some changes.
Well, what are some of the best sources of information on contractor marketing, other than stochastic marketing, that you would recommend to a marketing director who's either just getting started or is established and trying to get better? A newbie can't very well pick up a phone and call another contractor who may or may not have a marketing director. Maybe the person running all the marketing is the owner. Is there a source for that, an association, a publication? Where can they go to get that information before they start kind of building their personal network of peers in other similar companies? Where can they go to get some help on their own and instead of just getting on the phone and begging for people to give them kind of unsolicited advice?
Well, you can't, in my opinion, run an effective marketing program if you don't run an effective business and understand the industry. So I would recommend to anybody getting started in this industry to first start with pretty much any book by Ron Smith. I like a lot of the things he says, and while I can't say that everything he says holds true for everybody, a lot of the ideals that he throws out there align so much with what we see from successful businesses across the country. And I think that's a good place to start. There's that's a nice one where you don't have to ask anybody and you can learn a lot about the industry in a short period of time. There's another book called Guerrilla Marketing by J. Conrad Levinson, and just some great ideas in it on there about how mixing and a marketing blend work really well. And I found, especially when I first came into the industry, that a lot of people kind of hang their hat on doing just one thing. And having a good mix of things and understanding what things make up a good mix and what low-cost, no-cost things you can do really can drive some sales. I don't know how many times I've had conversations with people about door hangers, but I can just never get anybody to actually go do it. And if you take a look in that book, I also spent a lot of time on DecisionAnalyst.com reading the articles by Gary Upton. He's got some really good points there that just kind of clarify about targeting your marketing and focusing on some really small areas. And those are the things that in the latter part of and really Gary Upton hasn't updated a lot of that stuff since 2014, I believe, was a lot of the end of the articles there, but it still holds true today. And by kind of refocusing myself, by reading those articles and books in the latter part of my first year, really when I got to the end of year one, moving into year two, they helped me start to identify what I needed to look at in the response from my marketing, where our calls were coming from, and our customers to better understand what to do, where we needed to focus our dollars. So those are where I would start if I wanted to do it on my own. But obviously, you've got the Service Roundtable group is a great place to reach out if your company happens to be a member of that. If you're a member of a franchise like a 1 Hour or an Airtime, if you're in that group, your profit platoons are great places to go and have conversations. You just want to make sure you're having the conversation with the right people. I found, especially at larger industry-wide groups outside of necessarily my profit platoon, that I got such a varied response to my questions that I didn't know what to do with all that information. But when I sat down at something like a profit platoon, I could single out one person who had success in some areas where I was faltering, and they could walk me through the process they had taken, and we could compare numbers and things of that nature. And I think that's the big thing is sit down and have a conversation with numbers, because the big grandiose conversation without anything backing it up is what I think leads a lot of people astray.
Yeah, sometimes I forget the guys like Ron Smith, who've been around forever, and you can obviously Google him, find him on Amazon, and get his book, and it really doesn't cost anything, but it does give you kind of a little bit of the history and the war stories from building a business and marketing it and getting into homes, as well as, of course, if you do that, Amazon, one of the magic things about Amazon is they'll they'll point out all the other similar books you ought to buy.
Absolutely, they're great marketers.
And at least that's the kind of thing where someone comes in from outside the industry can get a little smarter without embarrassing themselves, kind of quietly. And that's really kind of the purpose of some of what we're trying to do here within Stochastic and sort of these kind of podcasts where we interview, half a dozen marketing directors to get their side of it, right, their perspective. Also have the similar conversations, similar questions to the owners of those companies to see the other side of the coin, kind of in addition to a lot of the other topics we'll be digging into through this series, which, of course, we want to make available to all our first-time listeners and customers, and anybody else that's just trying to get familiar with what we're doing at Stochastic Marketing. Eric, I appreciate you taking some time kind of making this available and sharing your experience with other members of our kind of growing association here, growing customer base. But I think
it's my pleasure.
Yeah, we'll get together again real soon and talk about this. It's a great way to kind of share information, and people can listen to it, pick it up at their own pace. But I appreciate the time, and let's talk again soon. But everybody, that was Eric Wytrwal, who's been with Stochastic now 5.5 years, right?
It's been a wonderful 5.5 years as well.
And I, like myself and everybody else here at Stochastic, all we do is talk about and think about contractor marketing and how to make it more effective. And we hope this helps you learn a little bit more about how to be more effective in your business. So I appreciate the time and look forward to catching up with you soon.